Please turn to the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 9, beginning in verse 11 this evening. Glad that you could come and study with us. So we continue to study the message that the Apostle Paul had dealing with the problems in the church in Corinth. In particular, in the chapters 8 through 10, where he began with a question apparently that they had asked him about meat offered to idols. And now he's discussing related topics in chapter 9, and then we turn to the meat offered to idols at the end of chapter 10. And so chapter 8 was talking about eating meat in the idol's temple. The sections we're in now, the first part of chapter 9, is talking about financial support of preachers, how that relates to matters of liberty. And then the end of the chapter and into the next part of the chapter 10, we're talking about self-control and the danger of sin. And then the last part will come back to idolatry and eating meat offered to idols. Now, special assignment for you. This is not in your book, so you might want to make a note of it in your book or wherever. What I'd like for you to do is to think of whatever specific examples of matters of liberty that you'd like for this class to discuss. When we finish chapter 10, I've been talking about save those specifics till we get to the end of chapter 10 when we got the whole understanding of the whole section. And then we can discuss and make applications, specific areas when we get to the end of chapter 10. So I want you to make a list of any of those specific areas you want us to talk about. Give me your list. I'll put them together and give them to the class so that when we get to those specific topics, we can come prepared. That we won't just be shooting from our hips or just at the top of our head. I, as a teacher, and you as students, will know what to expect and we'll have an opportunity to prepare. So if you have a list of or any topics you want to relate to this subject, please give me that information in the next couple of weeks, and I'll compile it. And I'm not promising that everything you ask will be covered. I don't know. Depends on what's suggested, of course, but hope you'll do that, and that will help us then to know ahead of time and be prepared to discuss those materials, those questions when we get there, okay? Any questions or discussion on the assignment? Okay. All right, so we're discussing the financial support of preachers, in particular Paul's liberty in regard to it. He talked about, as he began the chapter, that he had a right to eat, to drink, to marry, and to refrain from working. And these were all areas where he was exercising liberties. In particular, he talks about the fact that the laborer is worthy of his hire, and so he's discussing the principle that one who preaches the gospel has the right to accept financial support for the work that he does. He's going to show eventually that he didn't choose to exercise that in Corinth, or at least the church in Corinth didn't support him. And he's going to discuss why and so on, but that's another matter of liberty. You see that he chose not to exercise. But nevertheless, he's defending the right of churches to support preachers and preachers to accept support. So he gives some examples that he illustrates this with, that we talked about. So what were some of the examples beginning in verse 7 and the following verses? What were some examples that he gave to illustrate the idea that one who works has a right to be paid, to rewarded financially for the work that he does? So tell me at least one of the examples that he uses. What was one of the examples he used? Karen?
A farmer who plows his field has the right to partake of the crop.
Okay, a farmer plowing his field. Other examples? Terry?
The soldier who works for his government.
Okay, a soldier working, is supported by the country, the citizens. Okay, other examples? Frank?
Someone who tends to a flock or a herd.
Okay, a shepherd caring for animals. Okay. And there are some others, so we'll just summarize it. The soldiers are supported by rewarded financially supported for the work that they do. The one man who takes care of a vineyard, or a shepherd taking care of a flock, or even he used the example from the Old Testament of oxen are to be allowed to eat the grain as they trample it in accomplishing work for the owner of the oxen. And then the farmer, and we'll talk about another one yet this evening. Okay, so all of these are just illustrations to illustrate the principle that when someone does work, it's proper to reward them for the work, financially for the work that they do, and he's going to apply that then to preachers. And as he goes through the discussion. So that's where we were pretty much at the end of verse 10 last time. It's going to make application beginning in verse 11. Questions, comments, discussion through verse 10 before we proceed. All right, let's read then verse 11 through 18. We'd like to read chapter 9, verse 11 through 18. Bill, chapter 9, verse 11 through 18, please.
If we have sown spiritual things for you, it is a great thing if we reap your material things. If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things, lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar? Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. But I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things that it should be done. So to me, it would be better for me to die than anyone should make my boasting void. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe to me. It is not preached, if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But against my will, I have been entrusted with a stewardship. What is my reward then? That when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel.
Okay. So to go back to verse 11, he really is there making the conclusion or the application of these illustrations that he's given that we've been talking about. And what is his conclusion? Oh, wait a minute, before we do that. At the end of class last night, last time we were on question 9. I want to go back to that. I asked you to make sure you have some passages about the support of gospel preachers. So we discussed a couple of them last time. Let's discuss some more. Anybody have any other scriptures about support of gospel preachers before we go into verse 11? Other passages about support of gospel preachers? Anybody has? Terry.
Philippians 4:10 through 23.
Okay, let's everybody turn to that, please. Philippians 4 and verses. Well, what verse did you say, Terry?
I said 10 to 23.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at last your care for me has flourished again, though you surely did care, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Nevertheless, you have done well that you shared in my distress. Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only. For even in Thessalonica, you sent once and again for my necessities. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account. Indeed, I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things sent from you, a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. And my God shall supply all your needs according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus. Now to our God and Father be glory forever and ever. Amen. And then the rest of it's just reading.
Okay. All right. So this passage in 1 Corinthians 9 and this passage in Philippians 4 probably tell us about as much specific information as there is that I know of in the New Testament. There's a couple more we've talked about, but these two passages tell us about as much as any other passages on the subject of supporting preachers. What do we learn about supporting preachers from Philippians 4 here, we just read. What do we learn? Tell me something you learned from that passage. Karen?
Well, they sent the support directly to Paul.
All right, they sent the support to him. Okay. The church of Philippians sent to support Paul. Okay. What else do you learn? Terry?
That it was well-pleasing to God.
Okay. That God was pleased with it, that they did it. So it was a good work that they did. Other comments? What else do you learn? Okay, so here we have authority. You notice he said that the church supported to him when he was in Thessalonica. And they said it more than once, he said. And there was a blessing to them because of what they had done. All right, other comments on Philippians 4? Any other passage about supporting preachers that you would like for us to talk about? Any others? Okay, there's at least one more I'd like for us to talk about. 2 Corinthians 11, verses 7 through 9. 2 Corinthians 11, verses 7 through 9, because it's talking about Paul in Corinth. And I believe it relates to our discussion. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 7 through 9. I'd like to read that one for us, please. 2 Corinthians 11, verses 7 through 9. Bill, please.
You said 11 through 9? Or
7 through 9.
7.
Chapter 11, 7 through 9.
Did I not commit sin in humbling myself that you might be exalted because I preached the gospel of God to be free of charge? I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to minister to you. And when I was present with you and in need, I was a burden to no one. For what I lacked, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied, and in everything I keep myself from being burdensome to you, and so I will keep myself.
Okay. So, here in the second letter, Paul returns to the subject of his support. What does he say in these verses about how he was supported in Corinth? What do we learn here about his support while he was in Corinth? Bill?
Took from other churches.
All right, other churches. Said he didn't take anything from Corinth, but other churches from Macedonia, he said, came and supplied his need. Other comments? What else did we learn? Anything else we learned? Okay. So as we come back then to 1 Corinthians 9, we're going to see that Paul did not, just as we said in 2 Corinthians 11, he did not receive anything from Corinth, but he did accept funds from other congregations. Okay, that's not the only way he got support, but they did do that. Okay? And then commentary discussion on these other scriptures about supported preachers. Okay, so back to 1 Corinthians 9 then. Again, this is a very important passage to be aware of and to be familiar with, discussing the Bible teaching about supporting preachers. So back to verse 11 then, and question number 10. What's he talking about spiritual things and carnal things, and what's the point in verse 11? I'd like to, question number 10, who'd like to explain verse 11 for us? Steve.
The spiritual things refer to teachings and the ministry that Paul and his fellow workers provided to the Corinthians. Carnal things mean material or physical support, such as food, money, and other necessities.
Okay, so the spiritual things, the spiritual work that Paul had done, and those that were with him when he taught in Corinth, was for their spiritual benefit. And he's saying that's sowing spiritual things. But he says if we sow those spiritual things, then is there something wrong? Is there some problem that we would receive or reap physical things as a result? In other words, our necessities, food, clothing, shelter, whatever. Is there something wrong with us receiving that? Of course, it's a rhetorical question. The point is that just as in these other examples, that it was right for them to receive support income for the work that they did. The laborers where they was hired. Okay? Other comments or discussion on verse 11. All right, so we're reaching conclusions now. All these examples that he gave illustrate the point, but now he's making the application to preachers that as they sow spiritual things, which reminds us of the parable of the sower, the preaching of the gospel, and so on. As they sow the seed of the word of God, then it's proper for those who receive the message to support them for the work they do. Okay? Verse 12 then, and question number 11. What does he say about it in verse 11? Other people apparently, the first part of verse 12, it seems to me they're saying that they supported some other people. Why not Paul and his companions? But what does he say about it in the last part of verse 12? He's defended the right to receive the support, but what had he done in practice, the last part of verse 12? Frank.
The last part says that he endured all things lest it would hinder the gospel of Christ.
Okay. So he says, we didn't use this right. It's a right, he's defended it as a right, but he said, we didn't use it, lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. And we'll talk more about his reasoning for that later on when he explains himself more fully. But here we see then an example of foregoing a liberty. He had the right to receive support financially for the work that he did, but he didn't have to do it. It wasn't required, it wasn't forbidden. It was scriptural, but not required for him to receive it. Now the church ought to be willing to give it. The church should be willing to support, but the man has a right to accept it or not. And in Paul's case, he chose not to. He didn't exercise that liberty. So here we have an application of this principle, this concept of matters of liberty. Okay, other comments on verse 12, discussion. Okay, and then verse 13, another example. Question number 12 gives another example to illustrate the point. And what example is that? What's a further example in verse 13? Frank?
The example of the priests, Levites, who had been authorized to receive or partake from the temple and from the altar for their services.
Okay, so now we're going back to the old law, but he's now talking about an example of spiritual workers, people who give us spiritual service. He's coming closer and closer, you see, to his own case, or the case of preachers in the New Testament, those who are doing spiritual work under the Old Testament, the priests, the Levites, and so on. They ministered the things of the temple, served at the altar, and so on. And as a result, he said, they eat the things of the altar, they partake of the offering. So I ask you then the question, last part of the question 12, what are some verses, scripture that talk about that? Somebody have passages that describe how the priests and Levites were supported under the Old Testament. Scripture for us? Karen.
Leviticus 6, 16, and 26. Verse 26 says, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and to his son, saying, this is the law of the sin offering. In the place where the burnt offering is killed, the sin offering shall be killed before the Lord. The priest who offers it for sin shall eat it. In a holy place it shall be eaten in the court of the tabernacle.
Okay. All right, so there's an example of the sacrifice. The people would bring a sacrifice. That was a sin offering, I believe that one was. And so some of it would be burnt, but some of it the priests wouldn't eat. Okay, it was part of their reward for the work they were doing and offering the sacrifice and so on. Okay, other passages? I'll see some other hands. Frank.
Leviticus 10, 12 through 14. And Moses spoke to Aaron and to Eleazar and to Ithamar, his sons, who were left. Take the grain offering that remains of the offerings made by fire to the Lord, and eat it without leaven beside the altar, for it is most holy. You shall eat it in a holy place, because it is your due and your son's due, and the sacrifices made by fire to the Lord, for so I have been commanded.
Okay. So here the grain offering was eaten by the priest, Aaron and his sons and so on. He said, this is your due. The laborer is worthy of his hire. This is what you have earned this by the work that you've done, and so this is how God is providing for the needs of the priest. Okay, and there's lots of other examples. We could go on for a long time of passages like this, and we could bring in also the passages that talk about the tithes and so on. So here Paul is using this as an example, then an illustration in the of the concept that the laborer is worthy of his hire. But now we're talking about spiritual workers, not just a farmer or a soldier or whatever, but or even an oxen, but spiritual workers who are performing spiritual service. They were also rewarded physically for the work that they did. Okay, that's the point that Paul is trying to get them to understand and to illustrate from their knowledge of the Old Testament. Okay, other comments or discussion on question verse number 13 and these Old Testament examples. Anybody? All right, now we come to verse 14. And verse 14 is the summary conclusion. Here's what Paul has been driving at. Summarized in the conclusion of verse 14. All this is important. I hope you remember it, but especially remember verse 14. The verse you especially need to remember, verse 14. What's the conclusion? In verse 14 then, question number 13. What's the point? Terry?
It's very plain. Those that live by or preach and live by the gospel should get their living from the gospel.
Okay. God has commanded, not just a suggestion, not just a good idea. God commands this is the right of those who preach the gospel. And those who are supported by, or taught by those who preach, are responsible to be willing, by command of God, to be willing to support those who preach. Now we'll see that the preachers don't have to receive it, but the church needs to be willing to offer it, to give it. So the Lord has commanded, he says, those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. Okay? So, okay, comments, discussion in the other bill?
In Matthew 10:10,
Okay.
it says, not to beg for your journey, nor 2 tunics, nor sandals, nor staff, for a worker is worthy of his food.
Okay, and that passage was part of God, Jesus sending out the apostles on the limited commission, we sometimes call it, just preaching in Israel to Israelites. But again, they were to be supported with their needs met by the people they were teaching. Okay, so the principle is taught again there. All right, so just like the soldier and the farmer and the shepherd and so on, and the priests and Levites under the Old Testament, God's plan for the support of preachers is those who are receiving the benefit of the teaching should be willing to give financially to support them. Okay? Now, we're not given specifics here. We know from 1 Corinthians 16 it's done on the first day of the week and so on, but we discussed that when we get to chapter 16. But here we know that we should be willing to support gospel preachers for the work that they do in preaching. And that's the conclusion, verse 14, of all these examples and so on. Comments, discussion on verse 14 and the conclusions that he's taught here. Sharon.
It seems to me that this means, last chapter we talked about how a matter of liberty can depend on the circumstances. It seems to me like this verse is saying that it also, in a way, depends on the perspective that you're looking at it from. Like, in this same scenario, from the perspective of the church, it's not a matter of liberty. They're required to be willing to provide for the preacher, like this congregation has so lovingly done for Trevor and I. But it's from the perspective of the preacher that it's a matter of liberty. He's allowed to accept that or decide that it would be better to not accept it.
Okay. So we have there an application, and I think I personally think that's exactly correct what he's saying. So when we get to discussing other applications after chapter 10, we're going to see that circumstances alter conclusions. And it's easy I think, for people to think, well, I've got a problem of conscience about this, therefore you should do what I say. But sometimes there's a whole lot more to it than that. And that's why this is an important thing for us to consider. I've known of some who objected to the church supporting the preacher to work with the congregation. And they say, well, I just don't think that's right. Should we give in to that? To me, I don't believe we have the right. The preacher would have the right to say, I won't accept it, but I don't think we have the right to say we're not going to give it. Darryl, you have a comment.
Yeah, matters of liberty is an important topic, for sure. Although I think this passage and these couple of chapters here are less about matters of liberty and more about not insisting on a privilege that you could insist on. The brother who wants to eat meat could say, I have the right to eat this meat, I can eat this meat regardless of how it affects my brother. And Paul says, well, yeah, and I could insist that you support me regardless of how it affects the brother. But I don't, because I care about you, and me insisting on that caused problems. I was willing to give that up, and you should be willing to give up me if it causes your brother problems.
Right, but again, the point is different circumstances. And so as I said last week, I think what he's done is he's broadened the discussion from the eating of meats to other applications, which we need to do too, because there are other applications, as I mentioned last time, which most of us don't have a problem with the question of meats offered to idols. There are lots of other questions that we do have where the principles apply. And so, okay, I'm not going to say any more because we're going to get into it as we keep going. Okay, other comments? Okay, so now then, from verse 14, saying that the Lord has commanded that this is his arrangement for supporting preachers, Paul says immediately verse 15, I have used none of these things. I didn't ask for that support. I didn't accept it. He's going to explain why as we go down from verse 15. Okay? So, question number 14, how did Paul get his income? Verse 15. What did he say about his income?
In Acts chapter 18, verse 2 and 3, Paul goes to Corinth, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately came from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome and came unto them. And because he was of the same craft, he abode with them and wrought, for by their occupation they were tent makers.
Okay.
So he worked as a tent maker.
A tent maker. So he had, we would say, a secular job, a job on the side. Yes, he did his work of preaching, but he also supported himself and others that were with him, he says in Acts 20, verses 33 and 34. So he received income by working another job, and 2 Corinthians 11, sometimes other congregations sent money to him. But he didn't accept any money from the Church of Corinth. Not saying it was wrong to accept it. He chose not to accept it. And he'll explain a little bit about why as we go along. Okay? Other comments about how he was supported. Okay? So now, let's see, where are we? Question number 15. Well, we already discussed how it relates to matters of liberty. Other discussion on how this relates to matters of liberty in chapter 8. Okay, and then the last part of 15 into 16, he discusses why he preached then. He's trying to help us understand his motivation, why he preached and how it relates to why he chose not to accept financial support. What does he say about, in verses 16 and 17, about why he's preaching? What's his motive in preaching? Is he trying to get rich? What's his motive? Verses 16 and 17.
He was given that duty. He was given that duty.
All right, he's given a duty by the Lord, called, he was an apostle, called specifically by Jesus as an apostle to be a preacher of the gospel. What else does he say about his motivation? Rick?
Well, he also says he does this willingly. If I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, I have been entrusted with the stewardship.
Okay. Other comments or discussion on how he's describing his motivation? Okay, first part of verse 16, he says, if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for the necessity is laid upon me. Woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. So on the one hand, he knows he must do it. He's required to do it. But verse 18, he describes for himself some additional motivation, it seems to me like. What do you say in verse 18 about his motivation? And where are we now? Question number, 17 and 18. Okay? Terry?
Well, he's able to do it without charging. He's able to provide teaching to others and not charge them.
Okay. All right. Other comments?
I also think back to when Paul was baptized and became a Christian, and the Lord said to him, said to Ananias to go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel, for I will show him how many things he must suffer for my sake. So when you get that, you got that direct stewardship from the Lord, that had a great effect on Paul and his desire to fulfill what he was commanded or given opportunity to do by the Lord because of all that he'd done against the Lord.
Okay.
It had to be some part of his motivation.
Okay. All right. Other comments? It seems to me, and maybe I am not positive about this, but it seems to me that he's also, in a way, verse 18, saying that he's really trying to go above and beyond, we might say, the call of duty. He knows he must preach the gospel, but if he preaches without charging, then he's done even more than what he must do. So that again goes back to his willingness to forego something that he would have a right to do. So he does the preaching because he knows he must do that, but he goes even beyond that and doesn't charge the people in Corinth as an additional effort on his part for their benefit. Other comments through verse 18. And I also said, back in verse 12, I believe it was, well, maybe I'm wrong. Verse 12, and the last part of verse 18, he talks about that he might not abuse his authority. What do you think he means when he says, if I do this without charge, that I might not abuse my authority in the gospel? And back in verse 12, he said something about not wanting to hinder, that we haven't used this lest we hinder the gospel. So in what sense was he concerned about not hindering the gospel, not abusing his authority? Will you comment your thoughts on what he means by that? Thoughts? No comments? Okay, well, all right, Rick.
I get a feeling that there's definitely something with the Corinthians here that had brought up topics that he's defending now. He's not naming anybody or anything like that, but the topic is there, and he's defending it.
And when we get to the book of 2 Corinthians, we're going to see that apparently there are people who were accusing him of misusing his authority. That he wasn't a real apostle because he wasn't one of the original 12, so he wasn't a real apostle, and that he was taking unfair advantage of the people. And so it seems to me that Paul is going out of his way to anticipate those concerns and to help people to see that he really actually went out of his way to make sure that he didn't take unfair advantage of anybody. that he didn't misuse his authority, that he didn't do anything that would cause anybody to have criticism of him. You know, there are a lot of scriptures that talk about preachers who are just in it for the money, who are covetous, greedy, just looking for ways to get rich. And there's lots of preachers today that do that. And we hear about them frequently in televangelists and so on, and certainly in various denominations. And it certainly could happen to those who are preaching the true gospel, that their motivation could be wrong. And it seems to me like Paul is trying to do is to make sure that that people understand what his motive was, that he was bending over backwards, we might say, to avoid misusing this right that he had, and avoid giving people any possible grounds of accusing him of misusing his right. Terry?
He revealed so much of the gospel, or of the law, for us to, and he recognized that, and God recognized that, in saying, you know, my grace is sufficient for you, and these things, he saw them as things to help keep him humble, because he had given so much of the law, and some of it was very hard law that he had to give. And we hear even today people complain about Paul and what he taught, and how they feel like he stepped beyond his authority to do that, and we don't have to pay any attention to it. And it's not true, but even back then he was fighting with that.
Yes, and I think your point in 2 Corinthians 12 is, well, again, we get to 2 Corinthians, even God had done things to help keep Paul humble, because he had received so many revelations and so much, accomplished so much good. It would have been so easy for him to become proud and egotistical and misuse his opportunities. And so these kinds of things helped him, things he chose and things the Lord later chose, to help keep him to avoid those kinds of improper attitudes. Seems to me like he's discussing those concepts to some extent, well, in verse 18. Other comments, discussion through verse 18. Anybody? All right. The time's just about up. Let's go ahead and look at verse 19 quickly, because it introduces our next topic. He says in verse 19, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more." That introduces the next section of verses. And now he's going beyond the subject of financial support. He's discussing in general, and he's certainly way beyond the subject of eating meats offered to idols. He's discussing in general willingness to sacrifice of ourselves to help souls be saved. This is not just about eating meats offered to idols. It's much, much bigger than that. And it's not just about supporting gospel preachers financially. It's much bigger than that. It's other areas where he, as it uses himself, but the application certainly is to us too, we should be willing to make sacrifices to help souls be saved. And that's what he's going to talk about, beginning in verse 19. Other comments or discussion before we close? Daryl?
If I can take that and kind of reinforce the point I tried to make before, I think it's all the same topic. And what you just said about verse 19 is exactly right, that he's talking about making himself a slave to others out of interest in their salvation. That's what he's talking about in chapter 8. That's what he's talking about in the first half of chapter 9. And it's what he continues talking about in verse 19.
And I'll go further and say, that's the main point. The main point is not meats offered to idols. I don't think the main point is even actually matters of liberty. The main point is saving souls. What can we do, what should we do to help souls be saved? And that is the proper application of that discussion of love back in chapter 8. So think about those things. We'll begin then back to verse 19 and the following verses then next time. Thank you.